Welcome everyone to Include NYC Online, Strategies for Challenging Behaviors at Home. My name is Robert Carabay. I am the Operations Associate, Data Management, and Beth Golini is the Director of Parent and Family Engagement, School Age. She will be presenting today's webinar. So, a little bit about Include NYC. We have been around for more than 3 decades, helping young people with disabilities, their families, and the professionals who support them. We were founded by 3 moms who had children with disabilities and wanted to share information with other families to help New York City make informed decisions about special education, navigate disability systems, and advocate for themselves. We offer regular workshops, a helpline, and resources, which we are adapting to respond to coronavirus-related school closures. You can find all of this information on our website at includenyc.org. If you have additional questions, we encourage you to call our helpline at 212-677-4660 to speak to a family educator. In Spanish, the number is 212-677-4668. And now I'll turn it over to Beth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Golini. I'm the Director of Parent and Family Engagement here at Include NYC for school-aged kids. I've been working in education for the past 14 years. I've been a board-certified behavior analyst for the past 7, and I'm also a licensed behavior analyst in the state of New York. And I'm really excited to be here with you tonight and talk with you a little bit about challenging behavior. This is actually part 1 of a 3-part series. So I'll be speaking tonight about proactive strategies for challenging behavior. Next Monday night, I'll be speaking about de-escalation techniques and what to do when the challenging behavior is actually happening. And then the Monday after that, I'll be talking a little bit about strategies and tips to use to get your child to wear a mask. So I'd invite you to come back and check out those other sessions as well. So now we're going to get started. So our objectives for this evening, we're going to talk about what challenging behavior means, and we're going to talk a little bit about its form and its function. And then we're also going to talk about proactive strategies. So at the end of this presentation, my aim is that you'll have a better understanding of what challenging behavior is and also be able to name 2 proactive strategies that you can use to manage behavior at home. So our agenda for the evening, we're going to start with talking a little bit about understanding challenging behavior and talking about the functions of behavior. Then we're going to talk about 5 different proactive strategies. So we'll talk about routines, we'll talk about schedules, using choice, rules and expectations, and reinforcement. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the evening for some questions. If I'm not able to answer all of the questions, like Robert mentioned, please feel free to call our helpline. We have family educators who would be happy to speak with you. So we're going to start with talking about the meaning of behavior, challenging behavior, and what it communicates. So when we talk about challenging behavior, I want to start with this definition. This is from the New York City Department of Education's pyramid model training. And so they define challenging behavior as a repeated pattern of behavior that interferes with learning or engagement in pro-social interactions with other children and adults. These behaviors can include prolonged tantrums, physical and verbal aggressions, and disruptive vocal and motor behavior. So examples of that might be things like screaming, property destruction, self-injury, non-compliance, withdrawal. So I'd like to break that definition down a little bit. And so what I want to think about is, and when I think about challenging behavior, I think about behavior that occurs at a higher or lower rate than typical and interferes with the person's learning, engagement, or access. I'm going to say that again. So it's any behavior that occurs at a higher or lower rate than typical and interferes with the person's learning, engagement, or access. So when we think about higher rate challenging behavior, things that you might think about are things like hitting, screaming or yelling, tantrums, running away, which is also referred to as elopement. So those are behaviors that are happening more frequently or at a higher rate than we would want to see and are interfering with the child's learning, engagement, or access. Challenging behaviors that occur at a lower rate might be things like work completion. So that could also include things like chores, that could include refusal to make their bed, refusal to eat. That could include a lot of different things. So basically refusal to do would be lower rate. Can also include responding to others. So a child who doesn't respond when someone says hi or when someone's trying to engage them in a conversation. So what I want you to do is we're going to take about 1 minute, and I know I went through that really quickly, and I want you to note, if you're comfortable, in the chat box, what challenging behaviors you've seen in your home. The reason why I'm asking you this is that, like I said, this is a 3-part behavior series. And so if I know from this evening sort of what are the challenging behaviors that folks are facing at home, I can try to target the session next week on handling challenging behavior in the moment and de-escalation techniques to really match the behaviors that you guys are seeing at home. So I'm gonna give us about a minute and then we'll move on. Thank you to those of you who've already noted some things in the chat. That's really helpful for me for planning for next week. Thank you guys again for noting those behaviors, and I will use that data when I'm developing and shaping the presentation for next week. So I would encourage you to come back next week. Great, yeah. Thanks so much to everybody.
Sorry to interrupt. There's a Q&A question. Somebody is asking if we are sharing the deck. They should have received it, but we will send out an email with the slides again after the presentation.
Great. Okay, so thank you guys so much for all of the information that you're sharing. I really appreciate that, and it's information that I'll use when I'm shaping the presentation for next week. So thank you so much. So now that we've talked about what challenging behavior is, I want to talk a little bit about the why. So when we think about the why of challenging behavior, what I want us to think about is what's called the ABCs of behavior. So you may have heard this before in your child's school, or you may have heard this from your child's therapist, depending on if your child is receiving behavioral services. But when we think about the ABCs of behavior, we want to think about A is the antecedent. So that's what is happening right before the behavior occurs. That's the trigger. That's the thing that is happening right before. Then we want to think about the behavior. What specifically is the behavior? What's the action that's occurring? And we want to think about that in a way that's objective, measurable, and observable. And then the last thing we want to think about is the consequence. So what's happening immediately after? So an example of that might be the antecedent. You tell your child it's time to clean up for dinner. The behavior is your child screams. The consequence is you say, okay, we're not gonna have dinner right now. We'll wait a minute, right? So what we want to think about here is what's happening before, what the behavior is, and then the consequence. And the reasons why I want you to think a little bit about this is it can help you to identify what proactive strategy would be best for your child and for your family when we start talking about that. It can also be really good information to share with your child's teacher or with service providers. It's also something that I think is really important to share and to discuss with anyone else who provides care to your child. It's just good to know that what's happening with a variety of different people and see if you can see any patterns or any information that you can glean from that. So once we've thought a little bit about the ABCs of behavior, then we're going to think about the functions of behavior. So this is going to be a very quick review of the 4 functions of behavior. So behavior has 4 functions. The first is attention. So that means that the child engages in the challenging behavior because of the attention that's being given to the child, either positive or negative, that they receive after they engage in that challenging behavior. The second is tangible, which is access to an item or an activity. Third is automatic or sensory. So something about the behavior feels good or is meaningful for the child. And then the last one is this idea of escape or avoidance. So the child does not want to do the task and is looking for a way out, a way to escape or avoid the task, right? So when we were talking about the child who yelled when it was time for dinner, that could have been an escape avoidance response. So the child is yelling because they do not want to do whatever needs to be done before it's time to get ready for dinner, right? When we think about an attention function, that might be a child who is screaming, and then mom or dad or someone in the house looks at them and says, "Why are you screaming? What's going on? Let's talk about it," and starts to pay attention to the child. Tangible, so to access an item or an activity, might be, we often see this in classrooms, but a child who wants more time with an item where they'll refuse to give the item back. The reinforcer is having more access to that particular item. For automatic or sensory, I often think about a mosquito bite. Something about scratching the mosquito bite feels good, so that's why you do it. You continue to scratch because the scratching feels good. And then for that escape avoidance, it's typically around something that the child does not want to do and they're looking for a way out. So this was, again, a very quick review of the 4 functions of behavior. So some things to think about in here is that when you are thinking about your child's behavior, you can think about which function you think it might be, which can help you when you're determining which proactive strategies would work best for your child. Other things to think about if you want to know more about the function of your child's behavior, you might want a functional behavior assessment to be completed, and that's something you would speak with your child's school about. You could also see about working with a behavior analyst, and that's a person who can help you and your family, and they can learn the specific function for the challenging behavior and then help you develop a specific plan to target that function of the challenging behavior in particular. If you have questions about this, you can certainly call our helpline, and one of our family educators can talk to you about how to best address any behavioral concerns with your child's school if you have concerns about their behavior. So now we're going to jump into really the meat of what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about proactive strategies to manage challenging behavior at home. So like I mentioned before, we're going to talk specifically about 5 different strategies. We're going to talk about routines, we'll talk about schedules, we'll talk about choice, rules and expectations, and then we'll talk about reinforcement and have some time at the end for Q&A. So when we talk about routines, what we're talking about here is a sequence of activities or events or tasks that are done in the same way every time, in the same order. So when you think about a routine, I want you to think about building a habit. It's the same way every time. We're trying to build something over time and get your child to be comfortable with doing something the same way every time, becomes something that they're really comfortable doing and they're able to do independently. So the reasons why you might choose to use routines with your children there are a wide variety of reasons. The research has shown that there are multiple benefits. So we know that it can increase confidence and independence in your child. If your child knows what to expect, can help them to develop their confidence. It can help them to know what's coming next. It can help them to feel more comfortable performing the same activity again with more independence and so less help from you or an older sibling or something like that. It can also help your child to develop their self-control because it puts some limits and restrictions on their behavior and makes them understand the balance between when it's time to play and when it's time to do things that are more functionally appropriate, like taking a bath, brushing their teeth, mealtime, all of those kinds of things. There's also some information that it may help with reducing your child's stress. It can help to remind them that the environment they're in is secure. If they know what to expect, they don't have to worry about what if. And so it makes it easier for you to enforce rules, and when they know what's expected in terms of routines, that can really help them. The other thing it can do is it can sometimes help to create exposure to healthy habits. So if your child learns that I brush my teeth every night, then that would be something that might carry into their adult life or later life, so that they know that that's something I need to do every day. I was taught that I need to do that every day. I had a routine around it, and I did it every day when I was growing up. The other thing that can happen with routines that I think is a really interesting and really great reason to use them is you can see generalization of skills across environments. So I'm going to give you an example from my own life. So I'm a parent. I have a 2-year-old. And one of the things that's built into one of his routines is after he takes his bath at night, he gets out of the tub, he gets wrapped up in a towel, and he now calls that bundle time, right? So he's wrapped up in the towel, he says bundle. And what we've seen is that now that it's warm out, we've been able to use that part of his routine to help him transition from other water-based activities. So if we're playing with a water table outside and it's time to go inside, we can tell him, hey bud, it's time for bundle. And because that's been built into his routine, it helps us with that transition with ending the super fun water table to go inside and do something else. So again, that's another benefit to using routines. So when might you want to use this with your child? So the things that you would think about is you might choose to use this for any time when your child's having trouble with a specific task, if transitions are really challenging. You might also use it to build consistency and independence at home. It might also be something that when you're thinking about your child's challenging behavior, like we talked about before with the ABCs and the functions of behavior, if you know and you think, I think my child might have some escape or avoidance behavior, routines might be a good way to cope with that, a proactive strategy to target that, where you build a routine and a habit around completing the task that your child sometimes has trouble doing. So things that we want to think about in terms of a routine, some of the sort of tips and tricks for routines is routines should be predictable and they should be practiced. So ideally your routine is going to be very similar every day, right? Every day we do things in the same sort of order that we did the day before. So if it's your bedtime routine, you use the toilet, you brush your teeth, you read 2 books, lights go out. Your child will learn that every night the routine's going to be the same. So it's always toilet, brush teeth, 2 books. You could play around with maybe changing the 2 books. You could play around with incorporating some choice there, which we'll talk about later, and then lights out. But it's going to be predictable for your child, and they're going to practice it. They're going to have opportunities to engage with this routine and try it out. So you might want to think about when you're starting a routine with your child, creating a visual or a verbal cue. So what that might look like is maybe a picture schedule for the bedtime routine. Maybe there's a picture of the toilet, a picture of brushing teeth, a picture of 2 books, and then a picture of their bed. You might also want to use a verbal cue if your child is a little bit older, where you just tell them this is what we're going to do. With younger kids, you can just sort of start moving them through that routine, and they'll learn over time, over repetition, what the routine is. So when I mentioned my 2-year-old, he doesn't have a visual or a verbal review of the schedule. We've just done it so many times that he knows what is the routine every night around bedtime and bath time and things like that. So just that idea of being consistent, making it predictable, and practice with your child. Other things to think about are that what I'm giving you right now are recommendations. Anytime you're creating a routine for your child, it should be individualized for you and for your family and what works for you. So if I say you should do toilet, then brush teeth, and you say that doesn't really work for the way that our bathroom is laid out, or that doesn't really work for my child from a sensory perspective, or if I have them use the toilet too early, they have accidents, move things around, right? should be individualized for you and for your family and what will work best for your child. And I would say even with that, it may be different for different children within the same household. So if you have a younger child, the routines may be slightly different for that child than they are for an older child. So just to be flexible with that and figure out what works best for you and for your family. And so some examples of routines. So you might have a bedtime routine, like I mentioned before, where you use the toilet, brush your teeth, read 2 books, then lights out. Every night it's the same routine. The other thing that's nice about routines is that idea of generalization, you can carry it over into other environments, other locations. If your child knows that this is the bedtime routine, they could do that same bedtime routine at grandma's house, at their aunt's house, at there's a babysitter, any of those kinds of things. Those are all things that you can play around with routines. If you have a chore routine, right, you might have 2 chores that your child knows, these are my chores, this is my chore routine, I sweep, I dust 1 shelf, right? You might have a mealtime routine, you give your child a 2-minute warning for meals, then they wash their hands and their face, they choose a song to listen to while they eat, and then after their meal, they know to put their plate in the sink. And that's something that they've learned, and they do that same routine for every meal, right? For breakfast, for lunch, for dinner. And again, you would want to tailor that to what would work best for your family, for your child in particular. You might have a bathing or a hygiene routine, pick out your pajamas or pick out your new clothes, go into the bathroom, take your bath or your shower, depending on your child's age, dry off with your towel, go back into your room and get dressed, right? So again, it's just helping to sort of break down skills, put them into consistent routines so that your child can be successful with those sorts of things. So the next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is schedules. And schedules and routines are very similar. And I would say that schedules are just a longer string of activities, and the activities may change in a schedule, but the structure stays the same. So when I think about a schedule, I think about a classroom schedule, right? So the students know that there are going to be transition points. They know that they're going to change activities, but what the activities specifically are may change during the week or during the day. So it might be that you start with math, then you do reading on Mondays, but on Tuesdays you start with reading and then you do math. Again, there's a wide evidence base for schedules as a proactive strategy to help manage behavior, can help with planning, can help to build structure and consistency for children, helps with setting limits and expectations. Again, it can help with increasing independence. It can really help with transitions, which we know can be challenging for students. And so it's a good strategy to try proactively for a lot of different challenging behaviors. And so when you might choose to use this is you can use it really whenever you think it will help your child. I've found that it's especially helpful to build consistency for children who have anxiety or for children who have trouble transitioning between activities like we've talked about. It can also help, again, with that idea of independence. So I've found schedules to be really helpful while we're in this school closure and coronavirus situation, because it's a way to help my child be a little bit more independent when he is independently playing as part of his schedule. That's a time when I can make lunch or check my work email or something like that. So I found that to be a really nice feature of schedules. So other things to think about with schedules, there are a lot of different ways that you can run a schedule, a lot of different styles. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different styles and why you might choose to use them, or you might choose a different method. So schedules can be visual, they can be verbal, they can be written. And that would be dependent on your child's age, your child's ability, what works best for you and for your family. I tend to think that if the schedule has a lot of parts or is really long, it's probably going to be more effective if it is visual or written. because it can be hard to remember all of the steps in a schedule if it's verbal. So I tend to use verbal schedules for reminders, for shorter schedules. But again, that's something that you'll want to think about what works best for you, your child, and your family. You can have a schedule that runs daily. You could have a schedule that runs across an hour. You could have a weekly schedule. Again, that's something that you want to think about what's going to work best. Other things to think about with that are this idea of time-based versus completion-based. And so what I mean by that is a time-based schedule is something where your child learns that at a specific time, we switch to a new activity. So that's more akin to a classroom schedule, right? There's going to be a bell or some sort of indication that the time has elapsed and we're going to move to the next activity. And so that can work for some kids. In your home, that might look like something where you say 9 a.m. is quiet reading time, 11 a.m. is when we're going to play with our toys, noon is when we're going to have lunch, right? And so your child knows that at those specific time-based points, the schedule will change or shift. They'll move to the next activity. The other option to think about is what's called a completion-based schedule. And so what that looks more like is it's basically a schedule where you say, do this activity until it's finished, and then you move on to the next activity. So you're going to color this picture until you're done coloring. And then when you're done coloring, then we'll move on to our next activity. And so that can work as well. Sometimes that might work if the schedule has videos in it, or the schedule has building something with Legos, something like that, where you've built in completion. So they work on the task until it's completed, then they move on to the next task. I tend to recommend for younger children, completion-based schedules are often a little bit easier for them to understand. For older children, a time-based schedule can sometimes be easier for them to understand. But again, that's something you're going to want to play around with. And I think the other thing to think about and remember with all of this is that none of these schedules need to be fancy. None of this needs to be beautiful printed pictures. This can be a handwritten list on the back of an envelope. It can be a binder. It can be a sheet of paper on a clipboard. So it doesn't need to be anything super fancy. I know Robert dropped some links in the chat for some websites that you can use to build and create schedules, so I would recommend checking those things out. Other things to think about with the style is that for kids who are having trouble with schedules, you might want to start with a very simple schedule. So a first, then schedule. And then once your child is okay with the first, then, and so with the first, then you would say first books, then Legos, right? And once your child has mastered and is comfortable with the first, then messaging, then you can move to something that is more like a first, then next. So first books, then Legos, next snack. So that's something also to play around with. If you're finding that schedules are really challenging, you can try to sort of roll it back and try first, then schedules first, and then move on to more complicated or complex schedules. Other things to think about are if you make a schedule, do you want it to be a schedule that you write everything on one sheet of paper, or do you want your child to flip pages if you decide to use a binder? Again, these are just sort of things to think about. They don't really impact the functioning of the schedule. It just impacts the way that you're messaging it to your child, but just some things to sort of think about. So one of the other important things to remember about the schedule is the schedule needs to be reviewed with your family and with your child. So you have a couple of different options for how to review a schedule. So you can choose to review the schedule the morning of. So in the morning, we wake up, everybody eats breakfast, and then we go through our daily schedule for for the family or for each individual child, whatever works best for your family. Some families choose to review schedules the night before. And so that might look like at night as part of the bedtime routine, you talk about what are the things that we're going to do tomorrow, what's the schedule going to look like. If your child has a written or visual schedule, you go through that written or visual schedule with them. I think that both strategies are really effective. I would say for older kids, the night before can work. For younger kids, if you review the schedule the night before, they might not remember in the morning, so that's something to be mindful of. Or they might get too excited and refuse to sleep because they're so excited about the things that you told them that are happening tomorrow. So those are just two things to sort of think about and figure out what works best for you. The other option is you review the schedule immediately prior to starting, right? So if the schedule starts at 9 a.m., we review it at 8:55 a.m., right? We don't talk about it before then. It's just, okay, it's time to start talking about your schedule. Let's review it right now and get right into it. I think that can be a really effective strategy for small children. For kids who have any sort of anxiety or control issues, that can be really challenging for them because they want to know what's happening. They want to know what's coming next. And so if you wait and don't tell them until immediately prior to starting the schedule, that can sometimes be a challenge. But again, something to think about and figure out what works best for you and your child. Other things to think about with the schedule. I saw that there was a comment in the chat from someone who said that their child doesn't want to follow the schedule. One of the other things that I recommend is if your child doesn't want to follow their schedule, you can try adding some preferred activities into the schedule, either at the end of the schedule or mixed in as needed. And that can sometimes help if the child is reluctant to do the schedule, because the schedule has fun things embedded in it. And that makes the schedule less work intensive, which is sometimes what happens with schedules is they become very work intensive. And so children don't want to do them because it's just a lot of work for them. So that's something to think about. Other things to think about if your child is reluctant to start a schedule is start with a schedule that is just all fun activities that you know your child likes. And then over time, start to add some activities that are maybe not as preferred. And gradually over time, you can shape behavior and add more and more of the less desirable activities. So schoolwork or chores or things like that. I also just saw a comment in the chat about using time-based reminders for the schedule. And again, I think that's a great idea, a great strategy to use. The other things to think about with the schedule when using a schedule is you can use timers in your schedule. So you can teach your child to set a timer and say you're going to do X activity for X number of minutes, set your timer, and then when you're done with that timer, then you'll move on to the next activity. So that's another thing to think about that can be really effective for you and for your family. So one of the last things to think about here with schedules, sort of some tips and tricks, is this idea of flexibility versus rigidity. And so what I mean when I'm talking about that is I'm thinking about, and I've had happen to me in my career, where I write a schedule for a student. The schedule says it's time for books, and the child says, I want to do magazines. And so you need to think a little bit before you start using schedules about your level of flexibility. Are magazines the same? I would say yes. If a child says I would rather look at magazines and read a book, I would typically say that's okay, but that's something you'll have to think about and develop your own comfort level on. Other things you want to think about with your schedule in terms of this idea of flexibility versus rigidity is, what if your child says, I want to swap the order of activities? Is that something you're comfortable with? If your child says, I want to do this activity that's at the beginning all the way at the end, sort of thinking about those kinds of things. We also will talk more specifically about choice, but you can incorporate choice into the schedule. And so what that might look like is you tell your child, here's our schedule, and the choice is, do you want to color or look at books? They choose books. Okay, books are what's on the schedule. Then for the next binge, you want to do your math work or your reading work. You want to do reading, great. Then for the next binge, you want to do math or science. And so that's how you sort of build choice in. Basically, you give the child the opportunity to kind of build their schedule in a really structured way where you're providing one or two two or three choices. And the child says, I want choice A, choice B, then choice A again. And they build their schedule that way. So that can be a way to sort of incorporate choice. Other things I've done with schedules is added times in the schedules where it's free choice time. And so we get to a point in our schedule and now it's free choice time. And the student can say, I want to do X activity, and there's a bin or an array of activities that are available for a choice time. So those are sort of some ways to incorporate choice into schedules. So other things to remember with the schedules is, so we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and a lot of things are shut down and it's really stressful. And so you need to give yourself a little bit of grace. And so if you write a schedule and then you realize this isn't working today and it gets thrown out the window, that's okay. If you write a schedule and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm being super strict, I shouldn't be this strict, that's okay. You can think about it, you can change your behavior, but give yourself some grace around this. Or if you're thinking like, this is just way too much for me to consider at this point, that's okay too. Just think a little bit about giving yourself some grace. This is really challenging times for kids and also for parents as well. So give yourself some space around that. The last thing that's sort of one of these tips or tricks for schedules that I want to mention is that they should be individualized. So the schedule that works for one of your children may not work for another child. The schedule that works for your neighbor's child, excuse me, may not work for your child. And so thinking about making the schedule really work and be tailored and individual to your specific child will make it more successful. I see there's a question in the chat about what age is appropriate for schedules. I would say that you can use schedules really with kids of all ages. I use schedules with my 2-year-old. They're much shorter. They're very simple schedules. They may be like 2 to 3 items at a time. But you could use schedules with much older children as well. I mean, we as adults still use schedules in monitoring our own behavior. So schedules can be used sort of across the age range. Other things to think about with schedules, especially for older children, is that for older children, you may want to let your child monitor their own schedule. And so that's, again, when that time-based schedule can be really, really nice for them, because if they know at 10 a.m. I switch to the next activity, and they can read the clock, that can be really helpful. They can sort of self-monitor themselves through their schedule, which can be really effective. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is choice, and how you can use choice as a proactive strategy to help your child, excuse me, at home. So the first thing about choice is, even thinking about your own behavior as an adult, I assume that you like to make choices. You like to choose what flavor of ice cream you want to eat, what shirt you want to wear, what you want to make for dinner, what kind of exercise you want to do, all of those kinds of things, what you want to watch on Netflix, right? You make choices all the time. And so we want to think about offering choice to our children. So there are a lot of different reasons why we would offer choice. It again can help build independence. It's a developmentally appropriate skill for children to work on, that choice making and being able to develop choice making. It also can allow children to feel in control and give children some ownership of their day. And so that can be really helpful with choice. When you're thinking about choice, you want to start really small. What color shirt do you want to wear today? Do you want to eat a banana or an apple? Can become more advanced over time. So with older kids, you can do things like telling children, you need to do X thing, but you can choose when you want to do it. It needs to be done by 8 p.m. tonight, right? So you need to make your bed. You can choose when you want to do it. I just need it done by 11 a.m. And so you can sort of allow your child to make choices around when they want to do something, but base it on time, and that can be an effective way to incorporate choice for older kids. I do see that there are some questions about schedules, and so we can come back to that when we do the Q&A at the end. So thank you for those questions. I just wanted to acknowledge that I did see them, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So some tips and tricks to think about with choice making is you want to think more about talking about what is available and what is happening rather than talking about what is not available. It can be really frustrating for children if we're constantly telling them, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't go here, right? So we want to think about offering the things that are available. My typical recommendation for choice making is 2 to 3 options. I think more options than that can sometimes be really overwhelming for kids. Again, you can incorporate choice making into the schedule. But again, we want to make sure not to overwhelm our child with options and only offer the things that are truly, truly available, the things that you'd really be okay with. I still remember I worked at a school, and the principal brought one of the children who I was working with into her office and told him, you know, Johnny, you've been having such a great day. We're all so proud of you at the school. We want you to choose whatever you want as a reward. And the student said, I want to go to Disney World. And then the principal is in this situation where she can't take him to Disney World. And so she now has to say, no, I can't give you this thing that you made a choice about. So just be mindful of that when offering choice. Be really careful about offering just wide open options for choices. So I'm actually going to move us along so that we have enough time for Q&A. But at this point, I would ask you to think in your mind about a time you've used a choice with your child. I'm going to move us along just so that we have enough time to get to the question and answers at the end, but do think about a time that you've used choice, and think about a time, a way that you could incorporate more choice into your child's day. So now we're going to talk a little bit about rules and expectations. So when we talk about rules, what I think about with rules are things that are sort of longer term. They're often more general, and they apply to a variety of settings. They're sort of applicable across contexts. They can apply across ages. They're often linked with what we want children not to do. So don't hit, don't run, things like that. We're going to talk a little bit about how I would recommend framing your rules, but that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about rules. When we talk about expectations, expectations are more about what we want to see for behavior, and they're often in a more specific situation, like in the grocery store or in the park or something like that. And so those may be tailored to a child's age or development, and so they're a little bit more of a positive approach. So at the bottom, you'll see there's 2 examples. So a rule would be we keep our hands to ourselves. An expectation would be when we're in the grocery store, your hands stay in the cart. So thinking about how that rule can apply to a variety of settings, but then the expectation is really specific for what I expect from your behavior in this specific context or environment. So other things we want to think about with rules and expectations, we want to try to pre-frame what is expected every day and use action-based directions with our kids. Using schedules can really help you with that, to set those rules and expectations. When you're setting rules, the things that I think about are, I recommend framing the rule to be positive. So rather than saying something like, don't hit, I would use something like, we keep our hands to ourselves. Rather than no running, I would use something like walk, please, because then you're telling the child what you want to see them doing rather than telling them what you don't want to see them doing. When you're talking about expectations, you want to communicate those expectations really clearly. I recommend using I statements. Make it clear, make it direct, but also remember that less can be more here. So things that I think I have actually said in the past couple of days, we're going into a bathroom now. Remember, your hands do not go on the bathroom floor, right? We've made it very clear what the expectation is. Hands don't go on the floor, but it's very specific to that context. You might have an expectation around your child is helping to clean the counter after dinner, and you tell your child, I expect that you're going to use a paper towel or a rag and not just your hand to wipe off the counter, right? Again, we're being really clear and really specific, and that can be really helpful when setting rules and expectations. So what I want you to do now, and again, we're not going to do this in the chat just because we're running a little tight on time. So think about an example of an expectation or a rule that you've used with your child, and think about a way that you might choose to use an expectation or rule in the future with your child. The last thing we're going to talk about is a proactive strategy today, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. Is this idea of reinforcement. So reinforcement is basically the idea that we're trying to increase the behavior that we want to see, excuse me, and decrease the behavior that we do not want to see. So what we're doing when we're using reinforcement is you're figuring out and thinking, what's the behavior that I want to see more of? And you're providing reinforcement, and that might look like praise, that might be high fives, that might be hugs and kisses, that might be stickers, that might be any variety of things. Anytime you see that behavior, the appropriate behavior that you want to see more of happen. You might choose to use reinforcement if you have set out some rules and expectations, so your child meets the expectation or follows a rule. You're going to provide some praise, provide some high fives, hugs and kisses, stickers, whatever works for your child to try to increase that behavior that you want to see and decrease the behavior that we do not want to see. A way to think about reinforcement, and one thing that I think can be helpful, is at the beginning of this webinar, we talked a little bit about functions of behavior. So think a little bit about if your child is having challenging behavior, those functions of behavior. And if you think that your child is having challenging behavior for attention, think about, is there another way your child could get attention that you'd like to see more, and provide some reinforcement. So some praise, high fives, anything that works for your child for that specifically. The other thing to remember with reinforcement is that it's going to be different for every child. So what works for one child may not work for another child. So that again is something that you're going to want to individualize and make really specific for your child. So just sort of a general, really quick overview of what we talked about today. So we talked about how to promote positive behavior. The big things to think about are pre-framing what your expectations are, using those proactive strategies like we talked about, setting routines, using schedules, creating rules and having clear expectations, offering choices, identify and praise the appropriate behavior that you want to see. And then two other things to think about that we didn't talk about tonight, but I think are important to remember, is give your children words to express themselves, right? If you see that your child's starting to get frustrated, offer them some language around that. It looks like you're mad. Do you want to talk about that? Or I see that your face is getting really red. I think you're angry. Are you angry? Let's talk about it, right? Give them some words and some time to express how they're feeling. And then the last thing is play with your kids. Have a good time with them. You know, be there, be present, have fun with them. That can be one of the most effective ways to promote positive behavior in your children. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to look at the Q&A box in the chat and try to answer a few of your questions before we end for the day. Okay, so let's look at the chat. So someone asked about what age ranges was I referring to for time-based and completion-based schedules. It really depends on your child specifically. I have used completion-based schedules with my toddler, but the completion is like put 2 Legos together and then put Elmo in the box. So really simple, really, really basic completion. But I've also used completion-based schedules with much older kids with more complex tasks. So there's not really a specific age range. It's more about what your child's ability. I would say that the time-based, your child needs to be able to either set a timer or be able to read a clock in order for that to be effective. So I would think probably like 7, 8, 9, maybe, I think would be about the youngest I would try a time-based schedule. But thank you for the question. I appreciate that. So I'm going to look to see some more questions. So what can you do for older kids who keep telling you about updates or progress on their schedule or constantly interrupting the activity on the schedule? That's a great question. So some of the things that I've done in the past is I will remind older children like, oh, go back, look at your schedule. What does your schedule say you're doing next? And don't really provide a lot of attention when they come over to tell you about updates or progress. The other things I've done are schedule in time for them to give you updates and progress, right? If they have a completion-based schedule and they complete 3 activities, then check in with mom, tell mom where you're at, spend 5 minutes with mom, go over your schedule, review it. If they have a time-based schedule, you might put a specific time on there, like 11:15 every morning, we have a check-in about our schedule. 3:15 in the afternoon, we have a check-in about our schedule. Those are 2 sort of proactive things I would try, and I think that those might be helpful for you.
Hey Beth, this is Robert again.
Hi Robert.
I just want to point out a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A.
Oh, thank you.
There's a couple of people who are asking about bedtime routines and the struggle that they have at that time getting their kids to bed.
Yeah, so bedtime routines can be really challenging. The things that I would think about for a bedtime routine is trying to sort of wind activities down. I don't recommend including things that are really exciting or really make your child get really excited, I guess, in the bedtime routine. So things like videos are often not a good idea. Things that are really physical games are often not a good idea. I recommend quiet activities. If your child is really having trouble sleeping, I would also recommend talking to a pediatrician to rule out any sort of medical issues. Yeah, I think those are my best strategies and tips at this point for a question about bed. I also see that there's a question about getting your child to use the bathroom. And again, that's one where I would recommend, based on your child's age, talking to your child's pediatrician to make sure that there's not any sort of medical or underlying issue going on. Other things I've tried for the bathroom is using that idea of reinforcement like we talked about. and thinking about providing reinforcement for small steps towards the bathroom, right? So maybe we don't go all the way into the bathroom if going into the bathroom is a really significant challenge. Some things you might want to try might be that your child goes to the door and then there's some sort of reinforcement. That's also an issue that you might want to speak with your child's school about and see if they can help you with some more really specific behavioral strategies, perhaps using a behavior analyst or someone who can come in and really work with you and your child one-on-one. Okay, I see there's a question about how to register for the next webinar. I think there will be information about that that was in the email that you got from Include NYC. You can also find information about registering on our website. I also see that there are a couple of questions about challenging behavior specifically, and we'll talk more about that next week. And what to do when your child is having a meltdown, some de-escalation strategies and some techniques that you can use to help with challenging behavior when it's happening in the moment at home. So thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciated all of your thoughtful questions and comments. I hope to see you again next week and the week after. I do see questions about the slides and the resources. Yes, we can email the slides and the resources. I'd also encourage you, if you have questions or concerns about your child's behavior, please reach out to our helpline. We have family educators who would be happy to help you figure out who's a good person for you to talk to either at your child's school, your child's preschool, or someone who can be a support to you and your family. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.